So then I'll go to the next one. Okay, I like this one. So this is Tony again. So release versus integration. I was wondering what is the difference between those two concepts with regards to emotional processing. It seems to me, sorry, I just have to open it more. It seems to me like when we are focused on releasing emotional energy, we are just letting emotions out with the aim of relief. On the other hand, integration seems to be more nuanced intention, seeking not only relief, but also growth and understanding. It involves trying to incorporate the perspective that birthed the suppressed emotion into the larger whole of our psyche in a harmonious way. It would be very interesting to hear what Joe and Steve have to say about this and how important they think it is to understand why we are suffering and how we can embody the new perspectives that emerge as we release long held emotions without needing to purge them over and over again, but instead ground ourselves in a more expanded perception that creates a different emotional experience altogether. So I remember reading this one. I thought about this a little bit. So in the way that maybe you're phrasing it, then it would be two separate things. Although I would say that releasing emotions is integration. So maybe talk a little bit about that. So integration is the idea that you're broken, like so that you have all these pieces, and then it's kind of tricky, but it's like you have this thing that's you, and there are these parts that are missing, and then this is integration. Here's one more part, here's one more part, here's one more part. Um, But the first thing is that the word relief can have two meanings here. So maybe there's a little misunderstanding that the whole point is just to feel better in the moment. So it's like, I'm just going to cry so I can feel better. And yes, that does happen. That is a result of crying and releasing all of that pain. But the point is not to just get relief in the moment, because then that would just be, I mean, that can happen, but it would almost just be, I'm going to cry so that I don't feel this. Right? So that's not really the intention. But what I want to stress with that is, and then I'll go to the integration part, is that the reason why processing emotions, releasing them, is the most important thing is because this is not a spiritual thing. This is not some transcendent thing. We're literally talking almost scientifically of the body and the nervous system. And the fact that the three emotions, I don't know if I'm missing one, but it's the sadness, the anger, and the fear, which most of it is released. So anger, you have to feel it in the body, but then almost all of it is just crying. Those were moments in your life since you were very, very small that, let's say sadness, there was sadness. This is an electrical charge in your body. This is not a spiritual thing. So imagine there's like this shock. A baby just cries without thinking. They can't think. So there's the shock and the release, the shock and the release. And then as we are conditioned and we're around our parents and people, we start learning that it's dangerous to have these releases. But the shocks never stop. You can never stop feeling emotions in the body because it's part of being this body. And so what happens is if right now I'm a 5-year-old kid and my mother rejects me, my father does something, and I feel this horrible sensation. That's the electrical shock in this moment. But I've learned to hold in my tears. So the electrical shock hasn't been released. And again, this is not some imagination. An electrical shock cannot just disappear without being released. So it goes into the brain, it goes into the whole body. And so what you're literally doing is like going back in time and correcting what should have happened, which is releasing, right? Now, the integration part, I know what you mean by this, which is you're not just crying and crying and crying. And for example, you're a people pleaser and you let people abuse you and all this stuff. And then you just cry and cry and cry and you don't change anything in your life, right? Well, the thing is that as this process happens, this is what some people call downloads, or I would call just realizations, mental realizations. You have this like, oh my God, I can see this now, right? I didn't see this. So the example of people pleasing or an abusive relationship. Let's say that you, just to use Tony because he's in the example. Let's say that he's in a relationship with a woman who's abusive, right? She's always like putting him down, and now you know this. You know that you're kind of people pleasing, you're allowing the abuse. And let's say that you're crying now. So like she says something like horrible and then you cry. We are not suggesting that all you do is cry, 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 and then you just stay with this person and there's no change in your behavior. The more that you cry, the more that you will have the realizations like, oh my God, I've been with this person this whole time because I'm afraid to be lonely, I'm afraid to feel emotions. And then eventually it is impossible for this to not happen. If you're crying a lot, there will be a day, there will be a moment where you're like, "Oh my God, today's the day that I end this relationship." You won't be able to stop yourself. It will almost be like somebody's doing it for you. Some people would say like, an entity or something is doing it to you, but it's ultimately just you. So the integration, which is, I just want to see how he said it, intention seeking, growth and understanding. So the release of emotions inevitably results in changes in behavior, boundaries, like endless things will change. Um, and I want to address the part that says, because that was, it's an important one. So I'll just read it again. So it said, how important it is to understand why we are suffering and how we can embody the new perspective without needing to purge them over and over. So that's that without needing to purge them over and over. I already said the electrical charge, I explained all that. Um, that itself is a little tiny resistance to feeling emotions, which means that they're still difficult to feel. Because I've said this, if they were easy to feel, why would you ever even think of resisting them in the first place? It would be easy. It would almost be a pleasure, right? If it's a pleasure to cry, pleasure to have anger? I mean, kind of. It becomes fun, right? For you to finally own all of the stuff that you've been holding in. So it does become fun. It becomes almost pleasurable. You would never ask that, right? To say without needing to purge them over and over. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo your point about the integration and release are just uh, two sides of the same coin, you could say. So the process of releasing leads to the integration. You know, your repressed emotions are what prevent you from seeing reality and seeing you get a clearer and clearer image of what you've been doing this whole time and what's happening now, the more and more that you do this. And the insights that you get are about the truth of the situation because you're no longer you're less consumed by your oppressed emotions that feed your mental activity. So you cannot have a understanding deeper than the tears that you've cried. They are completely interlinked. So you can't say, oh, I will cry this at some point, but I would like to understand and grow. Because again, the some of the terminology used, like growth and understanding, it's kind of like trying to polish the self-image of I don't mean explicitly in a vain way, but it's like this I want to be more knowledgeable about all of this. And that can only, it's useless, honestly. On a mental level, there might be some intellectual understanding of what's being said about something that you haven't understood so far. But as long as it's an intellectual exercise, it does nothing for healing, and it only serves as a distraction. Actually, honestly, it will take you down the wrong path to have a mental picture or supposed understanding that isn't a physical understanding of what's happening. Will feed it will satisfy the egoic need for knowledge, I suppose, and it will just distract and distract away, which in a way the sort of question is as Steve said is a very cleverly disguised, can I do it without doing it? You know.
Yeah.
Um, and that might be difficult to hear because the actual understanding the that you may want will only ever come in truth, as in like the real understanding, as in the lived experience, and saying will only ever come through the processing. Just think of it as like a completely interlocked system where the crying, the realization, and the understanding are all together, and they will all deepen together, and they cannot be separated.
Yeah, and I something that you said about what I was going to say is that the reason why it's impossible for you to connect deeper and deeper with your pain and your emotions and to not have profound changes in understanding and therefore change your entire life and take actions is because I don't want to lose it. I'm going to remember. It's because like I'm going to give the same scenario. So imagine the Tony and he has a wife or a girlfriend that is abusive, right? But let's say that Tony up until now can't really feel emotions. Like you can always feel something. It's very uncomfortable, but if it's very numbed, you're feeling like 5% of the emotion, right? So it's not very dramatic, it's not very painful. And so when someone is extremely cruel to you, you're going to feel unpleasant, right? But you're disconnected from your emotions. And therefore, if you're disconnected from your emotions, you will stay there because your mind is saying, this is not that bad. This is
Mm.
not wonderful, but this is not that bad. But what if I take that 5% that you can only feel five and I increase it to 50? Now you're feeling the depth of what it feels like when someone just puts you down and says horrible things about you. Instead of 5%, now you're hit with 50. And when you're hit with 50, and then maybe if you're crying, when somebody does that to you, it's going to hurt so much like you were just burned that then if it happens again, you can't keep going. It's almost like I'm not going to be able to stand much more of this now that I can feel so much, now that I realize that I'm being deeply, deeply hurt here. And so that's why it would be unbearable. And then, even if it took a little while, it would be weeks if it got, and it could get worse and worse as the person kept abusing you. And then after a week or two, you would literally feel like you're forced and you're like, you know what?
Mm.
I've had enough of this and I cannot be abused anymore. And then it would be over. So that's an example. And believe me, once you get to 100, that's usually in when you get insanely sensitive on the spiritual journey. And this is usually the time when people start protecting their energy and then they get stuck in that where they're avoiding everything, thinking that it's everybody's negative energy. And this happened to me when I would it was so funny to remember it now. Like my dad would send me a video and my emotions were so heightened that I felt so much fear. It was so intense and I still was running away from, feeling things and I thought, "Oh, this feels so bad. I'm not even going to open the video to protect my energy." So that and then later on what I did because I got tired of that was I'm gonna do it on purpose now. I'm gonna watch horror movies. I'm gonna see things to really feel it. And at first it's like a nightmare because you're like the electrical charge is like at a million, right? You're just scared. But eventually you get used to it.
Yeah. And another quick thought that came to mind to sort of illustrate what I meant by the insight and the purging and release being intertwined is because the process of releasing these buried emotions or repressed emotions is the process of you could say dissolving the ego. Or and the more that you do it, the more you see through it. So you can only gain an insight when you see more of what's there, and that can only happen by releasing the repressed emotions. So if you imagine your ego as this sort of like very opaque layer, and every time you release emotions, repressed emotions. I mean, one time will make it's like but imagine you do it many, many times and the opacity goes down 1%. You can see through it 1% more. That means you can see more of what actually is there. You will see things that you didn't know and realize things that you didn't know are true. And it's not possible to see through a brick wall, you know.
Yeah.
So hopefully that sort of visual gives a bit clearer picture of what I was trying to describe.
Yeah, that was good. Um And then how are we for time?
Check. We are over an hour, but maybe we could do one or two more.
Okay. So